Lawson Manor, Ohio. Christmas Eve. A woman stands alone in a room full of smiling executioners. The air smells of cinnamon and expensive pine, but underneath the perfection, it feels like a crime scene. I am Caroline Lawson, and I walked into this house expecting a dinner, but I walked into an ambush. My family thinks I am here to apologize for existing. They don't realize that while they were erasing my wedding and burying my letters, I was gathering the evidence to bury them. They wanted to rewrite my story to save their reputation. Tonight I burn the script. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The Lawson house smells like cinnamon and floor polish, but it feels like a crime scene. That is the only way I can explain the sensation of walking through the front door after 3 years of silence. The air was heavy, perfectly climate-controlled, and thick with a tension that sat in the back of my throat like smoke. To the casual observer, it was a flawless Midwestern Christmas Eve. The garland on the banister was real pine. The lights were warm white and evenly spaced, and the fireplace crackled with the precise engineered warmth of a gas insert. But I knew better. In this house, perfection was just the blast shield for the cruelty underneath. My father, Mark Lawson, built this town. Not metaphorically. His construction company had poured the concrete for half the subdivisions in our corner of the state, along with the high school stadium and the new police precinct. My mother, Diane, was the social architect to his physical one. As the church social chair and the unofficial gatekeeper of the town's morality, she decided who was invited to the gala and who sat in the back pew. And then there was Jenna, my younger sister. The Instagram-perfect bride-to-be glowing in the center of the room, her hand resting casually on her fiancé's arm to show off the diamond. I was the anomaly. Caroline, the landscape architect living in Portland, the daughter who preferred dirt under her fingernails to a French manicure. I had returned home because I was summoned not for Christmas proper, but for Jenna's engagement dinner. The distinction was a subtle demotion, a reminder that I was a guest in the family narrative, not a main character. We were gathered in the living room, a space that felt more like a showroom than a home. The guest list was calculated. It wasn't just family, it was an audience. Pastor Miller was there balancing a crystal tumbler of sparkling cider on his knee. Gerald Kim, my father's business partner, stood by the mantel. Even Mrs. Halloway, a town councilwoman who owed her last election victory partly to my father's campaign donations, was present. They were the jury, and I hadn't realized yet that I was on trial. "We have a little surprise for Caroline," my mother announced, her voice chiming with a brightness that made my stomach turn. She gestured to a small, impeccably wrapped box on the coffee table. It was silver with a white ribbon, the Lawson family colors. I hesitated. "Mom, you didn't have to get me anything. I thought we were doing gifts tomorrow." "Oh, this isn't a Christmas gift, honey," she said, looking around the room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a life gift. Go on, open it." The room went quiet. Even the councilwoman stopped mid-sentence. I felt the weight of their eyes, the heavy expectation of the community pillars surrounding me. I reached for the box. My hands were steady, a skill I'd learned after years of navigating this minefield, but my pulse was hammering against my ribs. I undid the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in white tissue paper, was a book and a glossy card. I pulled the book out first. The title was embossed in bold, accusatory red letters, "How Not to Die Alone, A Guide for the Difficult Woman." A distinct, stifled giggle cut through the silence. "Jenna." I froze, staring at the cover. Beneath the book was the card. It was a printed gift certificate for a premium subscription to a dating app I'd seen advertised on late-night TV, one specifically marketed with the tagline, "For women whose chances are expiring." The silence stretched elastic and painful until my mother broke it. "It's just light-hearted, Caroline. Don't look so serious. We just want you to be happy like Jenna." The guests laughed then, but it was an uneasy, shifting sound. Pastor Miller cleared his throat and looked at the rug. Gerald Kim took a long sip of his drink. They knew this was wrong, but in the Lawson house you went along with the script, or you were written out of it. We're just trying to help before it's too late. Care, my father said, his voice booming with that jovial, terrifying authority he used in boardrooms. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, heavy and possessive. You can't live with plants forever. You need a legacy. I looked down at the book in my hands. How Not to Die Alone. A flash of memory hit me sharp and visceral. It was from 8 months ago. A small chapel on the Oregon coast, smelling of salt spray and rain. I was wearing a simple white dress I'd bought at a vintage shop. Standing next to me was Lucas, his hand warm and anchoring in mine. And in the front row of that tiny, intimate ceremony, there were 2 empty chairs. I had placed reserved signs on them, Mother and Father. I had waited until the music started, hoping the doors would open, hoping the FedEx tracking numbers hadn't lied, hoping they just got lost on the way from the airport. They never came. I looked up from the book and scanned the room. Jenna was smirking behind her champagne flute. My mother was beaming, waiting for gratitude. My father looked satisfied, like a man who had just fixed a structural flaw in a building. This didn't feel like a joke. It felt like being ambushed by my own family. It was a public execution of my dignity, designed to put me back in my place. The failure, the spinster, the cautionary tale. I didn't react. I didn't cry. I had practiced swallowing hurt since I was 6 years old. I placed the book gently back in the box and forced the corners of my mouth up. Thank you, I said, my voice flat, thoughtful. The tension broke. The conversation resumed louder now, fueled by the relief that I hadn't made a scene. We moved to the dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a mahogany table that could seat 20. We sat down for dinner. The roast beef was perfect. The wine was expensive. Just before the prayer, my father stood up, tapping his knife against his glass. A toast, he said, raising his goblet. To Jenna. For doing things the right way. For finding real love at the right time and bringing honor to this house. He paused, letting his gaze slide down the table to land on me. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth he performed for the town. Some daughters sacrifice everything for their family. Some just drift. I quietly set down my fork. The metal clicked against the china, a small sound that roared in my ears. They didn't forget my wedding. They knew. They received the invitations, the itinerary, the pleas. They didn't just ignore my life. They were actively trying to erase it. They wanted to bury the woman I had become so they could mourn the daughter they wished they had. I looked at my father, then at Jenna, then at my mother. They thought they had broken me. They thought I would shrink down, apologize for existing, and fade into the background like I always did. So I decided finally not to let them. The clinking of silverware on fine china was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, polite percussion that masked the absolute rot beneath the surface of our family dinner. I focused on cutting my roast beef into precise, manageable squares, refusing to look up. I knew the rhythm of these dinners. My mother Diane treated conversation like a tennis match, where she served every ball directly at someone's head. She wasn't done with me yet. The gift box and the humiliation in the living room had just been the warm-up act. You know, my mother began, her voice pitching up into that performative register she used when she wanted the entire table to pay attention. She swirled her wine, looking at the councilwoman and then back to me. Jenna's wedding is in March, and it's going to be just spectacular. 6 bridesmaids, a reception at the country club. Everything a mother dreams of. Caroline, tell us, when is it your turn? The room went dead quiet. It was the trigger question. The one designed to make me squirm, to force me to admit in front of the town's elite that I was single, unwanted, and failing at the one metric they valued. Everyone was watching Pastor Miller with pity, Jenna with a predatory little smile, my father with heavy expectation. They were waiting for the stutter, the excuse, the blush of shame. I put my fork down. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and folded it on my lap. My pulse had slowed to a cold, steady thrum. It already happened, I said. The reaction was physical. A fork hit a plate with a sharp clang. Tyler Brooks. Jenna's fiancé. A decent, soft-spoken lawyer who always looked slightly out of place in the Lawson Shark Tank frowned, his eyebrows knitting together in genuine confusion. My mother blinked, her smile freezing in place like a glitching video. "Excuse me," she laughed, a nervous, trilling sound. "What did you say?" I said it already happened. I repeated, my voice steady, projecting clearly to the ends of the table. "I'm married. His name is Lucas Reed. We had a ceremony in Oregon 8 months ago." For a second, nobody moved. Then my parents exchanged a look, a quick communicative glance that I had seen them use 1,000 times to align their stories. My father let out a short, derisive huff of laughter. "Don't joke about marriage, Caroline." He snapped, his tone hardening instantly from host to disciplinarian. "We have guests. Some of us still take family seriously. It's not something you make up for attention." "I'm not joking," I said. "I sent formal invitations via FedEx 2 months before the date. I sent an itinerary. I waited for you." "That is ridiculous," my mother interjected, waving her hand dismissively. "I never saw a single invitation. Not one. You must be imagining things, honey. Or maybe you addressed them wrong. You've always been a little scattered." "I didn't address them wrong," I said, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "And I didn't imagine it." "If we didn't get anything, that's on you," my father cut in, leaning over the table, his bulk dominating the space. "If you were serious, if this was actually real, you would have picked up the phone and called like a grown adult. You don't hide behind the mail for a life event like that. It's cowardly." "I did call," I countered, though. I knew it was useless. "I called and Mom said you were busy with the expansion. I left voicemails." "You are lying," Jenna hissed. She dropped her fork, her face flushing pink. "You are literally lying right now to ruin my engagement dinner. You couldn't stand that tonight was about me and Tyler, so you had to invent a secret husband. You always make everything about you, Caroline. It's pathetic." The gaslighting was a symphony perfectly conducted. Within 30 seconds, they had rewritten reality. I hadn't been ignored. I was incompetent. I hadn't been excluded. I was a liar. I hadn't been hurt. I was the aggressor. They were nodding at each other, validating their shared delusion, creating a wall of denial so thick that anyone else would have smashed against it and crumbled. But I didn't crumble. Instead, I felt a strange, icy clarity wash over me. I looked at my father's red face, my mother's feigned confusion, Jenna's theatrical outrage. This wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a mix-up at the post office. This was strategy. They wanted to erase my adult life because it didn't fit their script. They couldn't control Lucas, they couldn't control me in Oregon, so they simply decided none of it existed. I remembered the night before the wedding, sitting on the floor of my apartment, with Lucas crying over the tracking status that said delivered. Lucas had held me and said, "We keep everything, just in case." I had thought he was being paranoid then. Now I realized he had just seen them more clearly than I ever could. I slid my hand under the table and unlocked my phone. I didn't look down. I kept my gaze on my father, watching him pontificate to the pastor about the importance of proper communication. My thumb hovered over the Messages app. I opened the thread with Lucas. I typed a single word, "Now." The phone vibrated in my hand almost instantly. Read. I looked at my parents one last time. They had spent 20 years teaching me to stay quiet, to absorb the blame, to prioritize their image over my truth. Tonight I decided I would use everything they taught me against them. They wanted a show, I was about to give them one. My father liked to tell people I played with flowers for a living. It was a convenient reduction, one that fit the narrative of the flighty, impractical daughter who needed saving. The reality was that as a landscape architect specializing in eco-urban design, I spent more time in CAD software and reviewing hydraulic schematics than I did touching dirt. I understood systems. I understood how to map flow, how to manage infrastructure, and how to spot structural weaknesses. Years ago, before I left for Oregon, I had helped modernize my father's own company, digitizing his blueprints and setting up his project management tools. I had even installed the smart home network for this very house as a college project, paid in nothing but pizza and the promise of family exposure that never materialized. They had forgotten that part of me. They assumed that because I left, I had forgotten the codes. They were wrong. While they sat at the table drinking wine and pitying me, they had no idea that the man they were pretending didn't exist was currently dismantling their digital privacy from 2,000 miles away. Lucas wasn't just my husband. He was a cybersecurity engineer for a major West Coast firm specializing in digital forensics. Our marriage wasn't the flighty, impulsive mistake they painted it as. It was a partnership built on absolute mutual respect. When I had collapsed in the hotel room after our wedding, staring at the empty chairs, Lucas hadn't just offered platitudes. He had believed me, he saw the pattern, and then he had helped me quietly gather the evidence to prove it. We had been meticulous. Over the last 8 months, we had built a dossier that would choke a lawyer. We had the FedEx confirmation for the invitation box time-stamped and signed for by Lawson exactly 3 days before the ceremony. We had the logs. But the real key to the kingdom was the house itself. My parents, in their arrogance, had never changed the admin password on the home network I set up. It was still the childhood nickname my father used for Jenna Princess 98. That single lapse in security gave us access to everything: the front door cameras, the side yard feeds, and the internal router logs. But the smoking gun wasn't just the cameras, it was the emails. Lucas had helped me trace the digital silence. We found that a filter had been created on my mother's email account, accessed from an IP address matching Jenna's iPhone. The rule was simple and devastating: any subject line containing Caroline and wedding was auto-deleted. It skipped the inbox, skipped the trash, and vanished into the void. They hadn't just ignored me, they had engineered a blackout. I looked around the dining table. This was the moment. I didn't want to destroy them in secret. That would have been too easy and ultimately meaningless. My family thrived on public perception. They used the community, the church, the town council, the business partners as a shield and a weapon. They had used these people to pressure me, to shame me, and to validate their own saintly image. If I screamed the truth in an empty room, they would just call me crazy. But here, in front of Pastor Miller, who preached on honesty, in front of Gerald Kim, whose entire business relationship with my father was based on transparency, in front of Councilwoman Holloway, here the truth would draw blood. I needed to bridge the connection. The massive smart TV in the living room, currently displaying a loop of a burning Yule log, was hardwired to the same network as my father's home office computer. Lucas was waiting by his laptop in Portland, his finger hovering over the enter key. He just needed me to open the gate. "I'll help get the coffee started," I said, pushing my chair back. My voice was helpful, submissive, the perfect daughter. "Good," my father grunted, not looking up from his steak. "Make yourself useful." I walked into the kitchen, past the island where the dessert plates were stacked. I checked the sightlines. From the dining room, they could see the kitchen sink, but they couldn't see the smart home hub mounted on the wall near the pantry. I moved quickly. My fingers flew across the touchscreen interface. I wasn't just checking the temperature, I was opening the remote access port I had built as a backdoor for troubleshooting years ago. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The connection icon on the panel turned green. We were live. I typed a text to Lucas. "You're in." I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. My phone vibrated. I looked down at the screen. Lucas's reply was short, lethal, and filled with the fierce protectiveness that my own blood relatives had never shown me. Cameras and email pulled. "I've got everything. Say the word." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I could feel the weight of it against my hip, heavier than lead. It was the weight of 28 years of silence, of swallowed apologies, of being told I was imagining my own pain. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the cinnamon candles my mother burned to mask the smell of reality. For once, they wouldn't get to rewrite the story while I watched. I picked up the silver coffee pot, smoothed my dress, and turned back toward the dining room. I was ready to serve them what they deserved. I walked back into the dining room, the silver coffee pot heavy in my hand, but I didn't pour. I set it down on the sideboard with a deliberate metallic clack that cut through the low hum of conversation. The room quieted. My father looked up annoyed at the interruption of his monologue about zoning laws. "Sit down, Caroline," he grunted. Pastor Miller was just about to bless the food. "Actually," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the mahogany table, "I'd like to say grace my own way tonight." My mother blinked, surprised. "Oh, well, that's lovely, Caroline. Go ahead." I didn't bow my head. Instead, I picked up the remote control for the massive smart TV mounted above the fireplace. I pointed it at the screen, killing the looped video of the crackling Yule log. The room plunged into a sudden, stark silence as the comforting fire vanished, replaced by the harsh blue glow of a computer desktop. "What are you doing?" Jenna asked, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. "I'm giving thanks," I said. "For the truth." On the screen, a single folder opened. It was labeled in large, bold text, "Project Erase Me." A ripple of confusion went through the guests. My father's face darkened immediately. "Turn that off right now. We are not watching your home movies." "You told me to take responsibility for my life, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I am." I tapped the volume button on the remote, signaling Lucas in Portland. The first image maximized on the screen. It was a high-resolution scan of a FedEx delivery confirmation. "This is a delivery receipt from FedEx," I narrated, my tone shifting into the cold, clinical cadence of a forensic investigator. I walked toward the TV, using it like a presentation board. "Delivered to 412 Oak Street, this house, at 10:17 a.m. on February 8th. That was 3 days before my wedding." I pointed to the signature field on the screen. The scrawl was messy, but legible: J. Lawson. Someone in this house signed for my wedding invitations. They signed for the itinerary. They held the box in their hands 3 days before I walked down the aisle. "You didn't forget. You got them." My mother's hand flew to her throat. Jenna went pale. "And just in case you want to claim you lost the box," I continued, "let's look at the digital trail." The screen flickered and changed. Now it displayed a screenshot of my mother's Gmail settings. It was a filter rule, the kind buried deep in the advanced settings menu. "This is a filter created on Mom's email account," I explained. "Rule name: Caroline Wedding Filter. The conditions are simple. If the subject line contains Caroline and wedding, the action is set to delete. Skip inbox, skip trash, permanently erase." I turned to face the table. Pastor Miller was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open. Gerald Kim was frowning deeply, shifting his gaze from the evidence to my father. "This rule was created from an IP address that matches Jenna's iPhone," I said, letting the accusation hang in the air like smoke. "This is why my parents never saw any of my follow-up emails. This is why my voicemails went unanswered. Because my sister set their inbox to erase me." The explosion of noise was immediate. "I am overwhelmed by email." My mother sputtered, her voice high and frantic. "I get hundreds of church bulletins a day. I don't know how these things work. I was just helping organize." Jenna cried out, her eyes darting to Tyler, who was staring at her with a look of dawning horror. Mom was stressed. "I just helped clean up her inbox. I never meant to hurt anyone." My father stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "That is enough," he bellowed. "If you had any respect for this family, you wouldn't drag our private life in front of our pastor and my business partner. You are twisting things to humiliate us." I didn't flinch. I felt a strange, cold calm, the kind that comes after the worst has already happened. "Twisting things?" I asked quietly. "Dad." I stood in a chapel in Oregon and stared at 2 empty chairs for an hour. I thought maybe I had messed up the dates. I thought maybe the flight got canceled. I worried that you were hurt. I looked at the councilwoman, then back to my parents. "I sacrificed so much of myself trying to be the daughter you wanted. I thought I just wasn't good enough to remember. But it wasn't that. You didn't just skip my wedding. You built a system to erase me." The room was suffocating. Tyler looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Gerald Kim was wiping his mouth with a napkin, his eyes hard. My father, realizing he was cornered, didn't apologize. He didn't soften. He looked me dead in the eye, his face purple with rage, and delivered the truth I had needed to hear for 20 years. "If you'd lived the way we raised you," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet growl, "there wouldn't have been anything to erase." The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt. He wasn't denying it anymore. He was justifying it. He was saying that my existence, my choices, my life, they were mistakes he was entitled to delete. But instead of crumbling, instead of letting the tears fall, I felt the corners of my mouth twitch upward. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Funny thing about cameras, Dad," I said softly. "They don't care who you meant to hurt." My father stood up. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle feathering beneath the skin. His face wasn't just red. It was a deep, mottled crimson, the color of a man whose absolute authority had just been questioned for the first time in decades. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, looking down at me like I was a structural failure he needed to bulldoze. "You keep acting like a victim, Caroline," he spat, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and genuine disgust. "But you left us first. You left your faith, you left this town, you left your family. I'm not going to let your selfish choices threaten everything I've built here." He gestured wildly to the guests, to the house, to the life he had curated. "You were always the one piece that didn't fit. You were difficult. You were ungrateful. Honestly, it was easier pretending you weren't there." The line landed in the center of the room like a bullet. "It was easier pretending you weren't there." I felt something shatter inside me. It wasn't my heart that had broken years ago. It was the scaffolding of excuses I had built to protect him. For my entire life, I had told myself he was just strict, just traditional, just a little hard-edged, because he loved us. But in that moment, the rationalization dissolved. He wasn't a flawed father trying his best. He was a man who had actively chosen to erase his own child's existence because it was convenient for his ego. He had looked at the empty space where his daughter should have been and felt relief, not loss. My love for him died in that second, swift and painless, replaced by an ice-cold clarity that sharpened my vision. I didn't say a word. I simply pointed the remote at the screen again. On the massive TV, the video feed changed. It was grainy footage from the front door security camera dated February 8th. The timestamp in the corner ticked forward. On screen, Jenna opened the front door. She was wearing her pajamas. She signed the digital pad for the FedEx driver, took the distinctive white box, and smiled. As soon as the door clicked shut, the on-screen Jenna looked down at the label. She didn't look confused. She didn't call Mom. She walked straight to the blue recycling bin in the hallway, lifted the lid, and dropped the unopened box inside. The room gasped. But I wasn't done. The video cut to a second angle, the side yard camera I had installed to monitor the driveway. Jenna was walking to her car phone to her ear. The audio from the camera was crisp. "Yeah, she really thinks they're coming." Jenna's voice rang out through the living room speakers, dripping with amusement. She laughed, a sound that echoed hauntingly against the silence of the dinner party. "I'll make sure her little barn wedding stays a secret. It's better this way. She's so embarrassing." Jenna, the real one sitting at the table, let out a strangled sob. She reached for Tyler's hand, but he pulled it away as if she burned him. "And just so we're clear on who gave the order," I said, my voice cutting through the tension, "here is the CEO." I pressed the final button. The screen went black, leaving only a waveform visualization. The audio was unmistakable. It was my father's voice recorded in his home office. I had set up the microphone integration for voice commands years ago, and he had never bothered to disable the recording feature. "We are not flying across the country for her little rebellious stunt," my father's recorded voice boomed. It was cold business-like, the voice he used to fire subcontractors. "Throw any invitations away. If anyone asks, if the pastor asks, if your aunt asks, say the mail never came. We support family, not embarrassment." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a reputation disintegrating in real time. Tyler Brooks stood up slowly. He looked wrecked, as if he had just watched a stranger inhabit his fiancée's body. He looked at Jenna, then at my father. "You sabotaged your own sister's wedding," Tyler asked, his voice cracking. "And you've lied about it for months. You sat there tonight and watched her open that book about dying alone, knowing what you did." Mark Pastor Miller whispered, clutching his napkin. This is bearing false witness. This is malice." Gerald Kim, who had been my father's partner for 15 years, set his glass down on the coaster with a finality that sounded like a gavel. "Mark, if you can lie this easily to your own blood inside your own house, I have to question everything at the office. The contracts, the bids, everything." Jenna panicked. She stood up, reaching for Tyler again. "Tyler, please, I was protecting our parents. You don't understand. Caroline always makes a scene. I just wanted peace." Tyler looked at her hand, reaching for him, then down at the engagement ring on her finger. He shook his head. He slid the ring off her finger, not roughly, but with a detachment that was far worse. He placed it gently on the mahogany table. "I can't marry someone who ambushed her own sister like this, and never felt guilty," he said softly. "I don't want this kind of peace." My father lunged, not physically, but verbally. He turned on me, his eyes wild, realizing the walls were coming down. "You just blew up this family. You blew up my company over some hurt feelings. You ruined everything." I looked at him, at the ruins of his perfect dinner, at the truth laid bare on the table. "No," I said, my voice steady, anchoring the room. "I just stopped letting you ruin me in secret." The fallout was faster than the internet. In a town like ours, gossip travels faster than fiber optics carried on the whispers of church ladies and the text threads of city council members. By the time I zipped my suitcase the next morning, the structural integrity of the Lawson reputation was already showing hairline cracks. I could hear my father on the phone in the hallway, his voice strained, stripped of its usual booming authority. Gerald Kim wasn't just upset, he was taking action. I heard my father pleading, his tone desperate, as Gerald informed him that the city contract, the massive expansion deal that was supposed to be the crown jewel of the company, was officially on hold pending an internal ethics review. In business, trust is currency, and my father's accounts were suddenly overdrawn. 10 minutes later, the landline rang. It was the church. My father listened for a long time, saying nothing, his face turning a shade of gray I had never seen before. He had been quietly asked to step down from the major building committee for a season. They didn't say forever, but in our world we all knew what for a season meant. It meant hide until the stench blows over. I walked downstairs with my bag ready to leave. My father was waiting in the foyer. He didn't look like a man who was sorry, he looked like a man who was calculating damages. "You happy?" he asked, his voice rough. "You destroyed the family's good name in one night. 50 years of work, Caroline, gone. Because you couldn't handle a joke." "It wasn't a joke," I said, gripping the handle of my suitcase. "And I didn't destroy your name. I just showed everyone what you were doing behind it." My mother appeared from the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen. She reached out, not to hug me, but to grab my arm in a frantic, pleading grip. "Can't you just let this go now, please, Caroline? People will move on if you just stop talking. We can fix this if you just help us smooth it over." I looked at her hand on my arm, then at her face. She still believed that peace was just the absence of conflict. "You don't want peace, Mom," I said, pulling my arm away. "You only want peace if it looks like silence from me. You want me to help you pretend again. I'm done pretending." I walked out the door, got into my rental car, and drove to the airport. I didn't look back at the house. I flew back to Portland, back to the rain and the gray and the life that actually belonged to me. Lucas was there at the gate, and for the first time in days, I exhaled. But the Lawsons weren't done with me yet. They had one move left, the only move men like my father ever really trust: the transaction. 3 days after I returned, a FedEx envelope arrived at our apartment. The irony was almost poetic. They had used the very service they claimed to have ignored to try and buy my compliance. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside, there was a cashier's check made out to me for $75,000. Attached was a typed letter on my father's personal stationery. It was brief, cold, and unsigned. For what you sacrificed by leaving this family, use this to build the life you clearly prefer. In return, I expect no further public comments about the Lawson name, the wedding, or our business dealings. Consider this a severance of ties. I stared at the check. It was more money than I made in a year. It was a down payment on a house. It was a safety net. But I knew exactly what it was. It wasn't a gift. It was a muzzle. He saw my truth as a threat to be neutralized, a product recall he could manage with a payout. He thought he could buy the rights to my story so he could bury it in the archives. He thinks everyone has a price, Lucas said, reading the letter over my shoulder. He thinks you're an employee he can pay off. He's wrong, I said. We talked it over. Legally, I was on solid ground. The recordings were from systems I installed on networks where I was still listed as an administrator. I hadn't hacked anything. I had simply accessed my own work. But more importantly, I had the ultimate leverage. I picked up the check and tore it slowly, deliberately right down the middle. Then I tore the halves again. I arranged the confetti of blue security paper on the table next to the letter and took a photo with my phone. I opened the family group chat one last time. My parents, Jenna, and me. I attached the photo. Then I typed the only terms I would accept. I don't want your money. I want to be left alone. I won't press charges for the mail tampering, which, by the way, is a federal offense that could put you in prison and permanently end the business as long as you stop lying about me. If you speak about me, if you defame me to the family or the town, or if you try to spin this as my mental instability, I will release everything to the police. I have the logs. I have the video of Jenna destroying my mail. I have the audio. I took a breath. My thumb hovered over the send button. This was it. The final cut. If you try to erase me again online, at church, in town, I will file charges and turn over everything. I'm not your secret anymore. I hit send. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't want to see their excuses or their rage. I went into the settings and left the group chat. Then one by one I blocked their numbers. Dad, Mom, Jenna. The silence that followed didn't feel heavy like the silence in their living room. It felt expansive. It felt like oxygen. For the first time in my life, my silence didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. The apartment in Portland was loud, crowded, and smelled like garlic bread chili and cheap champagne. It was New Year's Eve, exactly a year and a week since I had walked out of my parents' house, and the contrast couldn't have been sharper. There were no matching linens here. There was no social hierarchy, no councilwoman to impress, and definitely no How Not to Die Alone books on the coffee table. Instead, there were mismatched chairs, dragged in from 3 different apartments, thrift store dishes piled high with potluck food, and a chaotic, vibrating warmth that filled every corner of the room. Lucas was in the kitchen laughing as he tried to open a bottle of sparkling cider for the kids. Around him were the people I had spent the last 12 months collecting. There was Sarah, a single mom from down the hall who taught me how to knit. David, a firefighter with a sleeve of tattoos and a gentle laugh. And Elena, an art teacher who had helped me plant the community garden box on our balcony. This was my life now. It wasn't polished, and it certainly wouldn't have passed my mother's white glove inspection, but it was real. I leaned against the doorframe watching them. I won't lie and say the year had been easy. Grief is a strange thing. Even when you cut out a tumor, the body still feels the trauma of the surgery. The holidays had brought a phantom pain, a dull ache where family used to be. I had spent Thanksgiving quietly, and Christmas had been a hike in the gorge rather than a dinner. I had lost the safety net of the Lawson name, the inheritance, and the approval I had chased for 3 decades. But looking at this room, I knew what I had gained. I had gained Sunday brunches that didn't come with a side of guilt. I had gained the freedom to design community gardens that focused on sustainability rather than status. I had gained the ability to breathe without checking the air quality first. I walked over to the desk in the corner to change the music playlist on my laptop. As I woke the screen, a notification badge caught my eye. It wasn't in my inbox, I had those filters locked down tight, but in a family folder I had forgotten to delete from the archive. It was an email from my mother. The subject line was blank. My stomach tightened, that old reflex kicking in, but I didn't panic. I clicked it open. It was short, written in her breathless, chaotic style, devoid of any real accountability. Caroline, thinking of you as the year ends. Your father is still hurt, and the business has been difficult, but we miss you. It's a shame how stress and miscommunication can tear things apart. We hope you're happy. You know we could never really erase you from this family no matter how much time passes. I stared at the screen, reading the words twice. Stress. Miscommunication. Even now, after everything, they couldn't type the word sorry. They couldn't admit to the cameras, the filters, or the cruelty. And then that final line. You know we could never really erase you. A year ago, that might have broken me. I might have replied screaming that they did erase me, that they had signed for my wedding invitations and thrown them in the trash. I might have tried to explain one last time why their version of love felt like a cage. But tonight, standing in the middle of a party that was loud and messy and mine, I realized something. They did erase me. They did it systematically and deliberately. The only reason they were reaching out now was that they hadn't expected me to keep the receipts. They hadn't expected the ghost to talk back. They wanted me to step back into the script to validate their delusion that this was all just a miscommunication rather than a betrayal. I hovered my cursor over the reply button. Then I moved it to the trash can icon. I didn't delete the email, I kept everything now, but I closed the folder. I didn't type a response. That was the new power I had found. I didn't have to explain myself to them. I didn't have to fight for my reality anymore. I chose when to engage, and tonight, I chose not to. Hey, 10 seconds! Lucas shouted from the kitchen, waving a plastic flute of champagne. I turned away from the laptop, leaving the Lawson family in the digital dark where they belonged. I walked back into the warmth of the living room. Lucas wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me into the circle of our friends. 5, 4, 3. The room chanted in unison. I looked at the faces around me. This was the American dream I had actually wanted, not the picket fence and the country club membership, but the resilience to survive the ambush and build something new from the wreckage. I had found a community that showed up not because of a last name or a business deal, but because they wanted to be here. 2-1 Happy New Year. Fireworks bloomed over the Willamette River, visible through the sliding glass door, painting the sky in bursts of gold and violet. I rested my head on Lucas's shoulder and watched the colors fade into smoke. I used to think family was something that could erase me. I used to think I was written in pencil, easily rubbed out when I didn't fit the lines. Turns out family is something I get to build brick by brick, person by person. I squeezed Lucas's hand, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of the life we had made. And this time, I'm writing my own name in permanent ink. Caroline finally found her voice, proving that sometimes walking away is the strongest move you can make. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming one's life, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. What would you have done in her position? Let us know down below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.